a background as a lawyer before accepting the calling to ministry. So I believe in always getting into good trouble. And I'm so thankful to be able to talk about social justice tonight and where we're going as a country.
All right.
I am Reverend Anthony Everett. I'm the senior pastor, lead pastor of Church in the Circle, University Circle United Methodist Church in Cleveland, Ohio. I also happen to be the president of the Center for Prophetic Activism Incorporated. I'm actually in a transitional type of situation where I'm in the new year. I'll be the executive director for Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, which deals with prison reform and restorative justice in Kentucky, of all places. And so thank you for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Bridgman?
I am not by any means the wisest person on this call. So while I appreciate the accolade, it's not true. I'm Valerie Bridgman. I am the Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. I'm also the founding president and CEO of Woman Preach Incorporated that brings preachers to full prophetic voice. So this work is important to me.
Awesome. So tonight, as we lean into our conversation, looking at the impact of the election, we planned this conversation before we knew who would win it. I know we all hoped for the outcome that we received. But, you know, we have experienced through both Democratic and Republican administrations, the poor still getting poorer. We've seen record explosion in mass incarceration in our local communities. And so we've participated. We've done a phenomenal job of getting out the vote. We've turned some red states blue. We've got the first African-American woman, Howard University graduate, serving as Vice President of the United States. Yes, amen, HU. But we know that the work is not done. The work that we must do is on the ground. It's local work. Many of our churches worked in get out the vote campaigns, souls to the poll, but the work must continue. The work must be done. And so we find ourselves in this theological tension for some where, you know, should the church engage in politics? Should the church engage in social justice? What is the role of the church in civic engagement? So we've asked Dr. Bridgman to kind of give us a framework to think about this for those who are listening, to sort of begin to think about practical ways. Now that the election is behind us, how should we be thinking about ministry and the work that we do in community? Dr. Bridgman, would you share with us?
I'll just volley some things and then let people go from there. I think I said yes to this conversation because of the title, Chaos of Community, Where Do We Go From Here? Which is the title of a Martin Luther King Jr. book, the last one that he wrote right before he was killed, in which he struck a hopeful tone that the work that was happening in the late 50s, mid 60s, 1960s, was having a lasting and ongoing impact on our civic culture as much as our religious culture. Recently, I read something, however, that sobers me a little bit, which is that right after Reconstruction, between the end of slavery, Reconstruction, right after Reconstruction, and the birth of the Klan and other kind of backlash, the nadir. Someone recently wrote, and I'm sorry, I don't know the author's name, that he felt like we were in a second nadir, that the backlash has been brutal and swift and unrelenting. And I think if we are honest with ourselves, that's probably true. And as we think about the role of religious people, not just the church, but people of goodwill, as King often referred to people, I think we have to walk that line between what is civic engagement over against trying to make sacred something that is really civic. I've been saying this a lot because I'm worried by something on the far, far right called the Seven Mountain Movement, where they believe it is their duty to take over culture as Christians. education, entertainment, government, I can't remember what all the 7 are, but to take over as opposed to being partners with all of our neighbors. And I think when churches choose the extreme of either not being a part of any civic engagement or seeing it as seeing their role as taking over culture, everyone else be damned. And by that, I mean non-Christians. And I literally mean they mean be damned, like go to hell, be damned. That's problematic. So that's that. And the last thing I would say as my opening volley is I have now been in several conversations where people want, and I've always wanted what I call easy answers, right? You know, how do we fix this, as if there's a 3-point plan? And I have been struck by, I really have been kind of struck by a text in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, that the people try to heal the hurt of my people lightly, slightly, saying peace, peace when there is no peace. And what I'm really trying to get at as I reflect on this and think about this is that we have got to figure out how we are going to interact with a world, a group of people who are committed to an us versus them world, when we cannot be committed to an us versus them world. And that will require something more than a Band-Aid. We can't, there's not a light healing to the wound that is deep in our culture. And if the church sees itself as just handing out platitudes or ignoring the people who see us as their enemies, we won't get anywhere in this work. So chaos or community, it will depend on how we engage this wound.
Dr. Augustine, before our call tonight, you mentioned about the work of reconciliation and forgiveness. Dr. Bridgman says that's a volley. So how would you respond to that volley and your thoughts and your work in Durham, North Carolina?
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Bridgman, for setting things up as you have. I wanna go back a little bit before I go forward and look optimistically and talk about reconciliation and talk about one of the core components of forgiveness. I think President-elect Biden is exhibiting that quite well. He quoted the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes the other night by saying that there's a time for healing. So he clearly is looking forward very optimistically and putting the foolishness behind him. But to sort of pick up on the parallel that you drew, that very dark period in our nation's history, post-Reconstruction. I am a son of the South. I'm a native of New Orleans, and I grew up where Confederate monuments were the norm. That is an echo of that same period I know as a period of redemption for white Americans, or a period of retribution, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it. That is the time where we saw the birth of the Klan. That's the time where we saw the erection of Confederate monuments, not so much to memorialize, but so to remind African Americans of their quote unquote place. If we think, and this obviously comes in the wake of unprecedented, at that time at least, unprecedented power given to African Americans by virtue of the 15th Amendment with the right to vote, and participation in the Congress, participation in the United States Senate, participation in local political office in an unprecedented manner. If we were to fast forward by 100 or so years, the parallel, I believe, is that President Obama brought out a period of Reconstruction, a second Reconstruction, if you will, almost a third Reconstruction, where in so many ways we saw diversity in ways we had not seen before. We saw inclusion in ways we had not seen before. We saw really the American dream living out. And we also saw a growth of the quote unquote silent majority, right? We saw growth of those who had been forgotten because they're not part of any sexy affinity groups. And in a very sage political manner, Donald Trump spoke to them with surgical precision. He spoke to them and excited them by using, at that time, dog whistle language, which later became bullhorn language, right? So we have seen under his administration a rise in hate crimes. This is empirical data. This isn't just me speaking. These are white papers published all over. We've seen a rise in hate crimes perpetuated, obviously, against African Americans, but against Jewish Americans. We have also seen police brutality in forms that take us back to slavery, right? We have seen things that really have been a retrogression, and no pun intended, for him to make America great again, right? So here we are now moving forward. As the old expression goes, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think about chaos or community. I choose to be an optimist and think about community, and that 145 million Americans cared enough to vote. 75 million Americans voted for diversity and rejected white supremacy. I choose to say that my alma mater sister, Kamala D. Harris, now Vice President-elect Harris, has broken a glass ceiling in such a way that women can recognize they belong and they are included and never feel limited by their gender. So I think we are moving incrementally forward. We obviously set back here with Donald Trump, but we're moving incrementally forward. And I think we certainly will be going in the right direction under under President-elect Biden.
Say more, Dr. Augustine. What does that look like for you on the ground in Durham as a result of what we're seeing at a national level?
All politics is local, as they say, right? So I'm a pastor who certainly is a reconciliation activist, but I'm someone who also believes in restorative justice. I'm someone who believes in making sure people are not just to vote, but are educated about what's on the ballot, not just in presidential election years, but something as local as dog collector, right? As trash collector or dog catcher, I should say. So as we move forward in the South, there are certainly some challenges that we have. North Carolina did not come out as progressively as I thought she would have. There are certainly some issues we've got to work through there in a local fashion, but overall, I am very, very encouraged about the direction in which the country is going. I am excited about my quote unquote platform in what is often considered a connectional pulpit in my denomination, in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I'm excited about the ecclesial leadership I've been afforded by being the spiritual leader of a national fraternity, of the oldest African American fraternity, that has allowed me to preach social justice from the mountaintops. And it has certainly been received in North Carolina, but more importantly, I thank Donald Trump for raising the issues and giving me a voice, right? So if Black America has done Rip Van Winkle, if America in general has done a Rip Van Winkle over the course of Obama's administration, there was an alarm clock that went off loud and violently when Donald Trump was elected to office. We're up, we're active, we're engaged, we are woke, as they say. So I'm encouraged by the role I'm playing, the role God is allowing me to play in moving not just the church forward, but advancing society through the church.
Thank you so much, Dr. Augustine. Many of us are familiar with the work of Michelle Alexander, the New Jim Crow, where we saw just phenomenal exponential growth and mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies. And Shanta, you and I talked a little bit about your work in Kentucky and your work now in DC around digital advocacy and your work around trying to get the right kind of district attorneys in office and get the wrong ones out. Can you say some more about the work you're doing in that regard and anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think this year we definitely saw the importance of engaging people around voting for more than just the president, right? Like a lot of people, realistically, a lot of people weren't big Biden supporters, you know? A lot of people were voting against Trump. They were voting against hate. They were voting against misogyny and a lot of other different issues that they were seeing. And so with DA races, engaging Black folks around, okay, this is the power that your prosecutor has locally. And I will say a lot of Black communities, especially if you have family members that have experienced incarceration, if you've experienced incarceration yourself, you understand the power of the prosecutor. You understand the power of the judges. You probably know them by name, you know, you might even have relationship with them in some form or fashion. And honestly, what we found at Color of Change is a lot of DAs don't even have folks who run against them. The incumbents win time and time again because nobody runs against them. And so in places like Durham, where the people pick the DA, in places like St. Louis, in places like Houston, Dallas, folks are really getting engaged around this election, these elections, off-year elections, because they understand the power of having a progressive prosecutor, a prosecutor who holds police accountable. You look at St. Louis, Kim, I forget her last name, but she's bringing up a lawsuit around racist legislation. She's done away with most convictions, weed convictions, things like that. And so at Color of Change, we're just really committed to thinking beyond just presidential and looking at advocacy 64 days a year. Elections are just one tactic in a much larger racial justice strategy. And I think Black people get it. Black communities understand that. That's not anything new for us, but it's interesting to watch white folks wake up to it. And I'm really glad that a lot of funders are starting to fund more local organizing. You have organizations like Black Church PAC, Woke Vote, different faith organizations that are engaging community. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Reverend Katina Jackson in the chat asked the question, is there any way to shift or mitigate the large number of conservative judges appointed under the Trump administration after the Biden administration commences in 2021? Anybody want to take that question? Oh, go ahead, Enchanta.
I definitely think just in general, we definitely need to have our own agenda around who we're demanding Biden and Harris appoint. We heard Biden say that basically Black people got him there and he is accountable to us. And so this is the time where we demand more than just local folks doing things, but we want to see certain people appointed. We want to see certain judges. We want to see Black women as attorneys. We want to see Black folks running HUD, different types of offices where Black people hold jobs to. We might not be the top appointee, but we are in those government departments. And so I definitely think now is the time for organizations, churches to start convening and literally listing out people that they would like the Biden administration to appoint, and creating strategies around, okay, these are the people that we want. How can we put these folks in front of them to let them know who it is we want? So it's not something where, oh, we didn't know, or we didn't know enough people to pick. We didn't have a large enough pool of folks to choose from type of excuse.
Thank you. Anybody else want to respond to that question before we move to Frank? Yeah, Jay.
I will just say very briefly, we will be hard pressed to do away with the long-lasting imprint that will be on the judiciary as a result of Mitch McConnell's collaboration with Donald Trump. He ran and promised to appoint rather conservative justices in the mold of Antonin Scalia, those who would overturn Roe v. Wade. That is meat and potatoes given to the evangelical community. He got 3 Supreme Court picks, and the last one is arguably the most conservative in the person of Amy Coney Barrett. With regard to the inferior courts, the respective circuit courts of appeal, and obviously the federal district courts, they also appointed very young judges, I mean mid-40 judges to those courts. So until a judge reaches retirement age and goes on what's called senior status, where they no longer are an active judge and they start diminishing the caseload, or start diminishing their dockets rather, the lasting imprint of having 40-something-year-old judges in the judiciary is that they're going to be there for a very, very, very long time. To make sure we are aware, federal appointments are lifetime appointments. So as much as we want everybody to be engaged in races, judicial races at the state level, or district attorney races and so forth, federal appointments are for life. So that means folks like Amy Coney Barrett, folks like Brett Kavanaugh rather, will be there for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I actually wanted to echo that and say that part of the challenge here is not only that he, McConnell and others, with the help of the Federalist Society, appoint these 40-something-year-old, mostly white, mostly male people. I think there's like 2 Hispanics of the nearly 300 people in the federal courts that have been appointed by the Republican Senate, because they were all confirmed, sometimes 10 at a time, sometimes 15 at a time. They weren't even vetted. And there are people on the courts now who has never actually served in court. This is their federal appointment is their first serving on a court. That is to say, they were serving as clerks for somebody, but they have not tried cases, never heard a case, never whatever. So this is a part of when I said what I was meaning when I said the wound is deep. I'm not trying to, when I say I want to be sober, I'm not trying to be, I don't mean by that I'm not hopeful. I just mean realistic. Like, so if we can't circumvent the federal courts, you know, the only way any of those people are not going to be on the court is if they are impeached. And you know the last time a judge was impeached? Anybody? Not at all. And so that the likelihood of that is not possible. What we will stand a better chance at. I grew up in the South too, Jay. It's good to know that. I grew up in Alabama in the shadow of Bull Connor's Birmingham in the 60s and 70s. What we have a better shot at is taking over, and I do mean taking over the Senate and deepening the House in a way that laws can be, in the way that legislation can happen. Because right now, the Senate does not govern at all. And they're committed to not compromising. And governing requires give and take and compromise. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bridgman. Frank, in light of the deep wounds and these young federal judges, Supreme Court justices, I mean, as a community organizer, is it futile? Like, what should we be doing in local communities in light of these deep wounds and these really difficult roads ahead that we have to travel?
So I think, thank you, Pastor. And I think building off of something Dr. Bridgman said at the very beginning of this is that there really is nothing easy in this work, right? I think people look to electoral politics sometimes as this simple solution. We just elect the right person with the right party name after their actual name, and that's going to somehow make things better. And I think that is not the challenge that I think we are called to, right? In Dr. King's book, that the title of this thing comes from, he challenges congregations and people of faith to build power, right? That is one of his chief challenges that he puts before us. He says, you know, the problem in the church has been that we see power and love as mirror opposites, right? That we can't build power because we are people of love. And he says, you know, if we don't build power, we will get nothing done. He said it much more eloquently than I will. But essentially, you know, his power on its own is reckless and abusive, but love on its own is sentimental and anemic, right? And the challenge he's having to us to build local power here is what's going to move things forward. Because in a place like New Jersey, right, to Pastor Wayne's point, like, we're not in the South, but our numbers, we are some of the worst in the country, right? So our wealth disparity is 50-1. White families have 50 times the wealth of African-American families, 50 times the wealth of Latino families. We have the worst racial disparities in state prisons in the country, not Alabama, not Mississippi, New Jersey. And in Morris County, it's if you're Black in Morris County, you are 22 times as likely to be in state prison as if you're white. And in that is Democratic administrations, that is Republican administrations that have fostered that, and it is up to the church to build local power to hold politicians of all stripes accountable. Because without that, no matter who the party is, they're not going to do what's necessary unless they're forced to.
Thank you, Frank. Dr. Everett, talk to us. I know you're doing prophetic activism and working with the church and community. How does the local church build power? Can we build power?
Yeah, thank you. I think that first, let me kind of jump back a little bit. I think that what Dr. Bridgman Valerie was saying earlier in terms of this focus on really understanding a deeper understanding of the problems that we're dealing with, I think that's essential. And the reason why is because we, as a country and as people, tend to focus on reconciliation. And we have to understand, what is it we're reconciling to? What is it that we're going back to? And I don't know a time in American history that I want to go back to. The whole idea of making America great again is a going back to, and I think that from 1619, Black folks have caught hell in these United States of America. And so we have to recognize that we have to have a real focus on where we're going, and that what's essential is that there's a lot of damage along the way that's happened to us. We have to repair that damage. I'm in favor of reparations, and really focusing on how do we heal the damage in our communities? How do we address those things? Going back to this whole focus on power. There's a book out. I'm in the middle of reading it right now. Alicia Garza, The Purpose of Power, and she speaks to this whole issue of power and how. And let me just say this. I haven't read the whole book, but then there's a great indictment on the church that the church hasn't done a thing. It hasn't done the good work that it needs to do, and that's saying that all churches haven't, because I believe that the church. I think there's this. There are two churches out there. Ralph Warnick talks about the double-minded church, where you have the church is politically active and the church that is complacent. And so I think that we have to. Our churches have to really focus on being politically active. In that sense. This is where prophetic activism comes in. Prophetic activism, this is my definition of prophetic activism, it's a faith-grounded, liberation-based ministry that matters, response to times of crisis and their imminent social problems. And so when we look at that, we're talking about faith-grounded, going back to to Valerie again, this focus on, it's not just a Christian faith, it's Islam. It's those who will consider them yogis, those who might be whatever it is that your belief system is, but all of us coming together because all faiths believe in justice. And it has to be liberation based, meaning that we have to address some of the issues that Carter G. Woodson was talking about when he was talking about liberation. He was saying that we can't focus on doing a job that just keeps our masters in control. We have to liberate ourselves, and the liberation comes from us. And so the church in itself, an election, getting out the vote is paramount, to part of the overall strategy of what we do in terms of moving forward as people. But we got to do so much more, And there are churches that are already doing that. There are a lot of churches that are out there that are in the forefront doing this type of work, but there are churches that are not as well. And there are churches that are, they have evangelical churches that are just as supportive of what is going on, that is undermining our very liberation, our very livelihood here in this country as Black people, people of African descent. And so when we talk about being prophetic. You know, a lot of times we talk about speaking truth to power. It's more than that. You know, it's actually living this out. It's actually having ministry that hits the streets and it's running this mattering to people who have lost all kind of hope. I've forgotten his name, the Hispanic theologian, Miguel del Torre. He talks about hope, and that when you have hope and you can walk away from the situation, that's really privilege. You know, real hope is when your back's against the wall, there's nothing else you can do, and you got to keep on pushing and doing and surviving and going. That's where we're at. That's what we have to do. My belief is that the church must come together, and we must come together with the activist organizations. We've got to come together with those folks that don't look like us, that don't believe like us. We've got to be engaged with all of these folks, because we're really focused on saving humanity. We got a pandemic right now with this coronavirus going on. And so, to give you a quick story, and I'll end it there. Yesterday, I got a call from a cousin of mine yesterday morning. It told me that two of his brothers, his older brother and his younger brother, in a hospital with the coronavirus. Yesterday evening, he told me that my cousin died. You know, that's what we're dealing with right now. That's what everybody, and it's not Black folks just doing, it's everybody dealing with this, you know, but we're hit the hardest with all of this. You know, our backs against the wall, and the only kind of hope that we can have is to push forward. And so, yes, you know, the election, I'm so happy that we had this election, and that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden won. You know, my HU sister as well. I went to Howard as well at one point. Didn't graduate from Howard, but that's another story. But right. Yeah, I'm still a Bison. But you know, I'm so glad that they won. And I think that what it does is just gives us some more ground to push up against the system that has been so divisive and so destructive to Black people and poor people and Hispanic people and gay people and everybody across the board, you know. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you, Dr. Everett. Jay, I'm coming to you now. Jay, you have pastored small congregations, not so small congregations. Now you pastor one of the larger congregations in Durham. You know, we got a number of pastors, congregational leaders on this call tonight who are listening in. What words of encouragement can you give pastors of smaller congregations who are resource constrained, lay people that have their backs up against the wall, but find it difficult to support the church, engage in community? What advice do you give pastors tonight who are listening in?
Sure. So my prophetic activism did not just begin with a prime pulpit appointment. It is something that began in me, Ernest, prior to my first pastoral appointment. But I certainly appreciate you recognizing I have done more with less and having to be very creative. And it goes to the point, Dr. Everett, my fraternity brother, I want to sort of take up where you left off. It goes to a mindset. You referenced our brother Raphael Warnock's book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Piety or Politics. It is a mindset. And in his work, Warnock cites Dr. King's first book. We're talking tonight, or we've been talking theoretically at least about King's fourth book, but King's first book was Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery story. And King creates a visual with his description of the cross, the two planes of the cross. I like to cite the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. And on the note of reconciliation that you mentioned, the vertical plane representing humanity's salvific relationship with God. We are reconciled to God through salvation, right? We're salvifically reconciled. There is also, however, the horizontal plane, which represents humanity's reconciled relationship with one another. King says that any religion that is only concerned about the souls of men, but is not concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that constrain them, and et cetera, is a dry as dust religion. That is a mindset. Warnock really embellishes upon that, obviously in the 21st century context, but it's a mindset to be prophetically engaged, to recognize that the church is not just here to serve and to talk about salvation and the kingdom to come, but we've got to deal with social injustices and social inequities and political activism in the kingdom at hand. So to your point, Dr. Williams and Brother Sidney, I just want to share to all the ministers out there, whether your church is in the thousands, whether your church is in single digits, the point is, it's a mindset to choose to be engaged in both planes of the cross, to be prophetically engaged and to preach people to glory, but also to recognize that speaking truth to power means you are called on in the image of Jesus, the Christ, as a Christian minister, to do as Christ did, and that is to be a social justice advocate, speaking out on behalf of the least of these. It's a mindset is the point I want to make. It really is a mindset.
You know, each of you have touched on something that is really near to my heart. And I want to say that I could say this, that all of you said it in a different way tonight, that the church has to work in concert with other organizations that may not share your doctrine or your faith. And Dr. Everett, you touched on a little bit, but you know, some of our churches are homophobic, xenophobic. We've got a lot of issues as the church. But to do this work in so a deeply wounded nation and a deeply wounded world, I don't see how we can afford, Dr. Bridgman, to just be Christian. Like the work has to embrace humanity in a way that embraces radical hospitality. Could you speak more to how we engage humanity and not trying to get everybody saved?
I mean, but part of what you're getting at is what I was trying to get at when I was talking about the difference between civic engagement and worship. Like I totally disagree with people who are antagonistic and homophobic and who are transphobic and any number of the sexist, all the things that churches do in the name of God, which I as a dean, sometimes I think, are we in 2020? Are y'all still talking about women can't preach? Really? Is that really something somebody's still talking about? But when you're talking about being neighbor, that's an entirely different thing. So the church is called, if you see where Jesus says, where the young ruler asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandments? And Jesus says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So if you claim you love God and you hating people because you love God, the second one is just like the first one, which is I know I sound like, I can't remember that kid show. One of these things is not like the other. This one is just like the other one, right? Which is, you can't say you love God and hate people. You can't say you love God and don't want the same thing for your neighbor that you want for yourself. If you say, I want clean water, I want my kids to have good education, I want whatever, you got to want that for everybody, whether they believe like you or not. Because one of these is just like the other one. It's just like the other one. You can throw the first one out if you don't go with the second one. You're never going to convince me that you love God if you don't love your neighbor like you love yourself. You're never going to convince me of that. Because how can you say you love God whom you've never seen and hate the people that you see every day?
That's awesome. Frank, you're a community organizer, and Chanta, you're out there doing community organizing work, digital advocacy. How do we build these coalitions to bring about this power that Dr. Everett spoke of and you spoke of, Frank? How do we create this power outside of our small congregations? And Chad or Frank, either one.
Take it away, Enchanta, and I'll jump.
Did you say take it away, Enchanta? I'll jump in. That's a little pop out, but I'll take it. No shade.
You saw right through it.
I definitely think people are trying to build the coalitions. With this whole Biden stuff, a lot of folks had to compromise, do a lot of compromising. We saw that a lot with activism. Folks who didn't feel the need to vote during the 2016 races decided, you know what, I'm going to do this. They didn't mess with Hillary. They didn't mess with a lot of folks on the slate. A lot of them didn't even mess with Harris, but they compromised. Even when folks started to come for Harris, once Biden announced he wanted her to be his VP and folks came for her, a lot of Black women in particular stood up and said, hold up, I might not agree with all of her politics, but you're not gonna bash and demean her and drag her online just because you're racist or just because you're sexist or what have you. So I think just thinking beyond the present moment, but I also don't believe in compromising when someone's a blatant racist and is causing you all different types of level of trauma and distress. I think that's a whole different conversation. And it's actually a deeper conversation than I have the capacity to go into, because I will say I personally struggle with that myself. Even when it comes to sexism, it's very difficult to work within the church because you see so many women, Black women, doing the work, working with the people, working with the congregation, working with the young people, but they're not considered a leader. They're not considered worthy enough to sit on panels like this. They're not thought of when people are trying to think of, oh, who can come speak here or who can come do this. They're not the first people to come to mind, even though they're doing a lot, if not all of the work. So it's difficult. And I actually will pass the mic on that part because I personally am still trying to figure that out. I think a lot of millennials are trying to figure that out. And I think we're all working through it. We're messing up, we're making a lot of mistakes, but I do feel a lot of hope when it comes to where we are now because we did come together in 2020 to get at least Trump out of the White House.
I think maybe building on that, I think your comment, Enchanta, about the messiness of this is important, right? Like, I think it is, I think organizing works well when coalitions are uncomfortable, right? Like when you look around the table and you're like, I'm not sure I want to be sitting across the table from him or her, right? And the reason why that's difficult is because we are complex, right? Like our organization in Jersey City is a coalition of 35 religious congregations and nonprofits, people of faith, people of no faith, people who believe that women can pastor, people who do not, people who are gay themselves, people who are not, and all standing together around common purpose where they can act in common on the common ground issues that are there. That doesn't happen overnight. It takes building trust, it takes building relationship, and it takes a willingness to be vulnerable with people who may disagree vehemently with you. And I think, but without that kind of relationship building that is tough and difficult, we're not going to build the kind of coalitions that can dismantle the type of power that we're up against, right? Like this is, racism is built into the structure of the house of our country, right? It is built into the studs. If we are going to dismantle it, it has to be people who are Black, people who are white, people who are Latinos standing ground together, people who are Democrats and people who are Republicans. And if we're going to build that kind of coalition, it takes time and trust. And it's particularly in a polarized moment like today, it makes it more difficult. But I think we have to be called to do it. That's my feeling. It doesn't make it less messy, to Enchanta's point, but we have.
Yeah, come on, Dr. Augustine.
Let me just real briefly say there is an old expression that I'm very fond of. That which divides us, that which unites us, is far greater than anything that can divide us. To Sister Jackson's point, if you think back about the 2019 debates in the run up to the Democratic primaries. The focus, we had a very, very diverse field of candidates, but the focus was ABT, anybody but Trump. So William Barber, in his book on the Second Reconstruction, talks about putting fusion politics over identity politics. And by fusion politics, I'm talking about coalitions of straight and gay. I'm talking about Black and white. I'm talking about Latinx and Jewish. I'm talking about people coming together to fight for common good. over the last 4 years, we have seen, we have been compelled by something that has been so incredibly bad. The entire Make America Great Again agenda is a throwback to something that we all thought was dead and gone. So it put fusion politics and a fusion coalition rather together, rather than having us separated by identity politics. The church has got a lot to learn from the political example set by the secular community. To your point, Dr. Williams, we can no longer be worried so much about salvation and be so heavenly holy that we're no earthly good. We've got to work in concert with others. We've got to work in community with others. We've got to work in collaboration with others, because as you say, Frank, it's on the stud. So it's as deep as the stud. So we've got to work together to get this out of this house that we called America, if we want America really to be what she can be.
You know, Dr. Augustine, you touched on something, and I want to push us a little bit into this conversation. You know, until we have the common enemy, in many of our communities, we're divided according to doctrine. You know, the Baptists say the Methodists don't have the water deep enough. You know, the Pentecostals say we ain't sweating enough, we ain't running enough. The stuff that divides us keep us from building the coalitions until the enemy is upon us. Why does it always have to be so great a threat, so great an enemy, before we can come together, build coalitions? I remember in our community in Morris County, you know, the divide was over same-sex marriage, right? You know, the Baptists can't work with the Unitarians and the Unitarians can't work with the Catholics. But then when the threat, it gets so great and we've lost so much ground, then those things that divided us for decades, all of a sudden now are not so big. But why do we have to wait so long before we can work together? I mean, you said it already. We've got federal judges on there going to be there 40 years maybe. Why did we have to wait so long to build these coalitions? Why didn't we get behind Hillary in 2016? Why did Trump even have to get elected? What would it take us to move forward without an impending threat so great as what we've seen in the last 4 years? Dr. Bridgman, come on.
Well, I mean, I don't know why Hillary didn't get elected in 2016. I know what people said to me when I was jumping up and down saying it wasn't about her, it was about the courts, it's about the courts. I literally was saying that in 2015, and I had several people say to me, I don't care, it's just something about her I don't like. And I would say she's been in the public life for 30 something years. And you are going to vote for somebody who is a reality TV person. And so you are spouting the oppositional stuff about her. Ask yourself about that. So that's that part. But what I really wanted to speak to is, how do you build coalitions in times of so-called peace?
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, somebody needs to be running around saying the field's on fire all the time, because there ain't no such thing. I mean, we need to be thinking about 2022 right now. If we want the Senate, seriously. And we need to be thinking about what we want locally, to Enchanta's point, in our various places. Frank, I'm with you. I did not run for office when I was in Austin. They kept trying to make me run. I didn't, but I was a pain in the behind as an advocate and an activist. And I was involved with different groups to make sure that the things that went before city council were the things we wanted before city council to get the right people in city council, the right people on the educational boards, the right people in the sheriff's office, the right people in the DA's office. You know, there's this local work, the right governor. Like literally, there is so much work to be done all the time. I kind of want people to start singing that old Negro spiritual, so much work to do. I ain't got time to die. I ain't got time to fight. I ain't got time to, you know, whatever, that we would spend this time thinking about what will make for a community where everyone thrives. We claim we want to live and let live. I just want y'all to let me live. Okay, well, let's build the kind of community where everybody can live and sit under their own vine and fig tree and thrive. and the last thing I want to say, you asked about people being concerned about people's soul. Well, this is at the core of most. Here I use conservative as a little c, conservative Christian thinking, which is the church's primary and sole point for being in the world is to save souls. It's not, it's to make disciples. So there's that. But if you think, well, if all I got to do is get the right notches of people saved, whatever that means in your theological framework, and not that I am building a community of faith that is a vicar in the earth. The word vicar means a representation of Christ in the earth, a sense of who Christ would be right now if Christ was here. I am real clear that Jesus couldn't walk in most people's churches and be accepted, because he hung out with all the wrong people, ate all the wrong stuff on all the wrong days, doing all the wrong things at all the wrong times. So literally, he couldn't be voted in the churches that vote for people, and he wouldn't be considered saved by most of us, So if you think about what it means for the church to actually be a representation, not the kingdom of God on earth, that's not the church's role, but really a representation of God's goodness toward all creation. All creation groans for the children of God to show up. There's a scripture for you out of 2 Corinthians. So show up. Show up for the goodness of all creation.
That's good. That's good.
I think y'all put me on here to quote scripture, so I'm gonna quote them as long as I can.
Come on, Frank.
I think, around your question about building power in peacetime, right? And how do you build when it's not a crisis? I'll tell a story that's not from the United States. I think that sort of, if we don't build relationships when there's not a crisis, we're not going to survive when the rubber meets the road, right? So my first experience organizing was in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and there's a mural on the Falls Road. It's a Catholic neighborhood in Belfast where it has a picture of this this shipyard strike, and it has Jim Larkin and James Connolly, these two union organizers there, and it says, "We struck not as Protestants, not as Catholics, but as people of Northern Ireland, and together we survived, or together we stood together," or something like that. And my boss at the time told me, I came back, I had a picture of it. I was very proud of this picture, and it was such a great image and message. And she looked at me and she said, Frank, that's not the right message of that mural. Because if you think about the actual history, the strike was broken in a week or something like that. It was broken in very short time by them playing on the hatred between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. They used the sort of disagreement there that allowed the Protestants to go back to work and Catholics to be left without jobs in that place. And her response, she's an old trade union organizer to me, was the message of that mural should be build relationships and trust now, so that when the rubber meets the road, you don't sell out your brother, you don't sell out your sister, you stand together and fight for justice. And I think that's what we're called to do, is we have to build relationships now, and not just for the war, but for the moments that we have to work on now and for all time. Because to Dr. Bridgman's point, it's not that there isn't a crisis for lots of people all the time, right? People are in real pain all the time.
That's so powerful. I want to come back to Enchanto on something you and I talked about around digital advocacy. There's a Netflix show out around social distancing. And so with the advent of social media, people have become more distant and more buried into their silos. And yet a lot of people are using digital advocacy to promote their issues and try to make things happen. Speak to us, Enchanto, about sort of social media, digital advocacy. How does it bring us together rather than make us more distant from each other?
A lot of people, have a lot of negative things to say about social media. I actually really, really love social media and just digital creativity in general. I think it gives you an avenue to think of things beyond what's in front of your face and to create relationships with people across the world who, in moments where you might feel very isolated in your community. If you think about just simple, I don't know if y'all remember Black Planet. I was talking to Dr. E, Pastor E the other day about Black Planet, but it was like this social dating type of website where Black people came together. But I was like 14 or something when it came out, and I was living in rural Kentucky, and it was a great way because I lived in a town of 1,000 people, less than 1% of us were Black, but it was a great way for me to meet other Black folks in Bowling Green or Hopkinsville, E-Town, different places across Kentucky. We were able to build relationships. So when track season came, we already knew each other when we were at the track meet. We already built that relationship already. And so social media has shown to be a great way for relationship building, in addition to just education. A lot of folks are saying, especially this year, I've heard it time and time again from people who aren't necessarily deeply engaged in movement work. Wow, I can't believe how educated people are. I can't believe how well-versed people are when it comes to different types of issues, different types of causes. And a lot of that is because social media, is because information is being shared online, and young people are engaging and eating it up heavily. And they're creating their own theories and their own thoughts around these issues. And so social media is a great tool, not only for that, but also for what Color Change and Rashad Robinson, who leads Color Change, often calls shifting a moment to a movement. And so that means all the building that we do that's not talked about over the years, all the relationships like Frank was talking about that are built that aren't on mainstream TV, all of that continuously happens, and then boom, a big moment happens and it's on CNN, MSNBC, but because you did all of that building beforehand, you've created the narrative, you have your messaging together, you have your coalition, you can coordinate with each other to push your messaging simultaneously online. So you're clear that even if people don't know that you're working behind the scenes with the NAACP or Move On or what have you, y'all are still pushing that same messaging to your various audiences who might not like each other, who might not agree with each other, but that's kind of how you get on the same page. And so I do think social media is extremely powerful. I honestly wish that it didn't increase so much anxiety and depression, and it would be even more of a greater tool, but that is also part of social media as well, the downfall of it. But yeah, I just think it's a really good tool when coupled with community organizing, because everything isn't online, right? It definitely has to have that community organizing component. I consider myself a digital organizer, but I started off as a community organizer, working with Pastor E in Kentucky, working with BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100, different things like that. And because I had those tools, because I watched people like Pastor E trying to get a garden in the back of our church, which was, the church was embedded in my neighborhood, Winburn, in Lexington, Kentucky, a community that needed a lot of resources. But the church members were a lot of folks who did not live in Winburn, and they weren't thinking about what the community needed. And I watched Pastor E time and time again advocate and say, we need a community garden, we need this, we need that. But that, of course, wasn't on the front page of the Herald Leader, right? That behind the scenes work wasn't there. So because it wasn't in the Herald Leader, or because people weren't talking about it, or some people were, on social media, you can push all of that out. And people who align with you and people who align with Pastor E, I don't even really know who formally introduced us, but I knew a lot about Pastor E because of Facebook, because I saw that Kentuckians for the Commonwealth and what did we call it? Witnessing Wednesdays.
Yeah, with
The
witness on Wednesdays. Yeah.
Yes, where we were at the state capitol, things like that. Social media helped push those types of messaging and those types of events. And so I do believe in the power of digital organizing when it is coupled with community organizing.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? I mean, right now we're not gathering in our churches. How are we using digital media to keep people focused on the issues at hand?
If I could jump in for a quick second on that, you know, in some respects, it's sometimes it can be a blessing, you know. If, you know, traditionally pastors look at what are the numbers like on Sunday morning, you know, and now we're looking at how many people are clicking to our website, you know, on Sunday morning. And then when you have a dynamic, powerful preacher like Dr. Valerie Bridgman preaching, you know, I'm just telling you the truth. This is the truth, Doc. You know,
numbers up. We get our numbers up.
Man, my numbers just going through the sky, Doc. You know, but you know, I mean, people are searching for a prophetic word, one that is going to talk to the times. You know, and you know, when we didn't have this, and we were in our churches, of course, you get a lot of people love the preaching when you're talking about politics, they say, or prophetic, or being prophetic in the pulpit. But then you always get the persons that say, you know, just preach Jesus, baby, you know. So, and you know, how do you bring them to that understanding? This whole idea of reaching beyond through the IT and using the web to be able to reach out to people, social media in all kinds of ways, it just broadens that touch, and you get people that are either interested or people that actually didn't have an interest at all in the first place, but now they're turned on to something different they never thought of or saw before, you know. So I think that I mean, this is a crucial tool, you know, for us, and you know, for me, it's been a real blessing.
All right. Go ahead, Jay.
I just want to very briefly address Dr. Everett. You made a very critical point, and I just want to flesh out a little bit from it, because there is a misnomer. Just preach Jesus, baby. That goes back to the salvation and the kingdom to come. And on the note of Warnock's book, the political action in the kingdom at hand, right? We're not dealing with that. Aubrey Hendricks does a great job in his work. The book's called The Politics of Jesus, right? Jesus was arguably the most political figure of his time. He obviously came, I believe, you know, to go to John as God incarnate for the purpose of bringing salvation. But Jesus also came to speak truth to power, to address social inequities. And if you think about his call, if you will, and you think about the manifestation of his call, when he comes out in the 4th chapter of Luke, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, I have come to give sight to the blind. I've come to set the captives free. I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus came as a radical preacher who was about social justice, who was about turning over an imperialistic system. He came to address the white supremacy of his day, which was a Roman imperial rule that persecuted Jews. Jesus was as political as they come. So that is really a misnomer when so many people say, just preach me Jesus, baby. If you really are preaching Jesus, you're going to preach politics.
We have
Amen.
a question in the chat. I don't want to leave this out. This is one of my former students from Drew Seminary, Dr. Reginald, soon to be Dr. Reginald Steele. He asked the question, if land acquisition historically created the bargaining space for congregation and civic connection, what can or what does the church use now, seeing that outside corporations and groups own and occupy most of the land within urban-based cities? Anybody want to take that?
I was waiting on Frank and Jay. Come on, y'all.
Well, let me say this. Maybe I'll try to help clarify what he's talking about. Is we are losing our churches, physically losing. We are literally selling churches. And some suggest when this pandemic is over, at least 1 out of 4 church buildings will close and not reopen. And these churches were the places for organizing. They were the places for strategizing, meeting. And now our communities are being gentrified. People are being displaced. Where are those safe places? Where are the new brush harbors? Is it just digital, or do we still need physical building? Do we still need land to gather? I think that's what Reginald's getting after. What do we do with the land that we are losing? Some of our congregations already, I know in New Jersey, we've sold over 20 churches just in New Jersey alone because churches just cannot sustain themselves.
So I was waiting on Jay and Frank. Let me just say this. There are a couple of things that I want to point to. One is that the church has long been the church, even when it didn't have a building. Mm-hmm. So this gets to the level of who do you collaborate with? Mm-hmm. The congregation that I helped lead when I was in Austin didn't have a building for some time, and people thought we were a huge congregation because of the way we engaged our community. Mm. But we collaborated with another organization, used their buildings because it was closed on the weekend, and used our homes and the places where we congregated with one another as places where we organized, whether we strategized, and the whole 9 yards. In some ways, people are being forced back to house church. That's the first thing. I'm not saying that's an answer for everything. The second thing is, I will say this about connectional churches, but I would also say this about congregational churches. I think churches are being forced to I don't know how to talk about all the splits that happened where you ended up with 5 churches that came out of one church, and now you don't have but one church now. Where are those people going? There needs to be some reconciling and reconstituting so that, yes, you lost 4 buildings, but you still got one. What if everybody of those 4 buildings actually moved back into those congregational spaces, made that place a formidable community spot, and used it well? Now, I know enough about church folk to know that's easier said than done, but I do think that's where we're being pushed to. And I really do want to hear from Pastor Jay about that.
Let me back up from etymology, from an etymological perspective. The word church, as you know, the ecclesia, as we see it for the first time in the scriptures in Matthew, it translates from the Greek to mean an assembly or group. The church are people. It's not a physical brick and mortar structure. However, because we are people and because we are loving people, we do need a physical space to interact. So to go to the first point of the question, as Dr. Williams raised, I don't think digital is the end all be all. I think it is great. It helps increase your footprint, but I think there's got to be some physical contact. Having said that, I think a building is nothing more than an asset that can be used the same way people use a house as a line of credit, the same way they use it as a fiscal asset to leverage something else. So unless there is a very historic significance that this particular building has got to be the church in which you convene, you can meet anywhere. You can meet at a Starbucks coffee shop. Now, I will tell you this, Dr. Williams is aware, in my own personal experience, the church I served prior to being assigned to St. Joseph, which is a wonderful, wonderful congregation in Durham, North Carolina, was historic St. James AME Church in downtown New Orleans. Now, why is that significant? It is the oldest African-American church in the city, Protestant African-American church in the city of New Orleans. It is the oldest AME church in the Deep South. So obviously, to qualify that, Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, was established in 1816. The church I previously served in downtown New Orleans was established in 1844, and the building where I led worship was erected in 1848. That church has been there for a very long time. That is significant. It's very special to me because I was assigned years after Hurricane Katrina, but at the time Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, the church, the physical edifice, was not insured. And Hurricane Katrina did quite a dizzy on the physical structure. So much of my work was building restoration. Much of my work was raising funds to preserve a legacy that means a whole lot to a whole lot of people. I'm so delighted the membership of the church doubled in the process of doing so. I'm so delighted that the revenue of the church increased dramatically during my tenure there. But in some regards, a building is very significant. But I think that's the rarity. I think that's the exception much more so than it is the rule.
And maybe to take this in a slightly different direction from how you all have answered as well, is to say, I think that we have to fight for land, right? That the way power has operated, the way race has played out in our country, is that land has been taken away from people of color, from people who are poor. And when Dr. Steele or Mr. Steele says that corporations and developers are taking the land in our cities and turning them into luxury developments, this is why we have to fight, right? We have to fight back to actually take that land and ensure that our communities are given it. Because if you want to know how power plays out in northern New Jersey, it is who owns land, right? It is who gets tax abatements. It is all those sorts of things. And the people who get tax abatements are oftentimes billion-dollar corporations, those that own it. Dr. Willie James Jennings talks about in this lecture that pastors need to become experts in zoning, in the ways in which this plays out, to fight for the housing that their people deserve. And I think in every city, you can see the geography of how power politics has played out to cut people out. So we have to fight back and build the power necessary to get the land for our people.
Frank, that is so amazing. Sorry, Dr.
Before you say that, I want to say this about collaboration. It made me think, Frank, of a conversation when years ago when I lived in Austin. There was a very wealthy church on the other side of town. Figure out all that. And when I say very wealthy, I mean very wealthy. They were having conversations in their session over, they were fighting over building a covered walkway on their campus for $2 million. And they literally called me in and asked me about this. They called me in the session and asked me about this. And I looked confused, and they asked me why I was confused. And I said, because right across I-35, there are struggling sister churches that I bet if you split that money 10 ways, they could do so much with that in the way of ministry and care and whatever. Why don't y'all, instead of spending $2 million over a covered walkway on this campus, why don't you spend $200 on big Texas-sized umbrellas, and they can just be at every door and people can walk their way across the campus with a big umbrella, and then they get the coverage they need. They looked at me like I had spoken a language they had never heard from. Like it would not occur to them not to spend money that way. And I said, I don't mean in some charity way about this $2 million, but that's a foolish way to spend $2 million. I know you don't think it is, because you don't think about what's on the other side of I-35. So part of what I think maybe Brother Reggie or whoever asked that question is challenging those people who claim to be, and I'm sorry, I'm skeptical about people's faith traditions, but claim to be our siblings in the faith, about how they're spending their money, about why they aren't helping us keep our buildings, about, especially if they literally, if you got $2 million lying around to build a covered walkway.
You know, as churches consider selling their properties, we ought to really be thinking about how can that property be used. We said, I think you said the horizontal, Jay, in terms of our neighbor. When we sell these properties, those properties could have been used to create affordable housing. They could have been used to age people coming, to people aging out of foster care. They could have been used to people coming home from prison, right? And so when we sell property, right, and we don't think about the mission beyond worship, right? Oftentimes we think, okay, well, there's no longer a worshiping congregation here. But what else could that property be used for? How can God be glorified for our neighbors, right? I think you said, Dr. Bridgman, these two commandments, they're both as good as the other. So just we're not worshiping there, we're not sort of baptizing folk and serving communion. You know, can we house people? Can we feed people? How can we serve you with this property? And unfortunately, when we sort of point the fingers at developers and we talk about gentrification, I think we got blood on our hands because we've sold property and oftentimes we didn't even get the best dollar for it. And we've sold property that was acquired over 3, 4, 5 generations. To Dr. Augustine's point, you know, we're not going to get these properties back. We can't afford to acquire these properties. So, I mean, I think Reggie's point is that is as much of an asset in organizing, you know, may not be for worship. Could be something entirely different.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I
Yeah.
think that we have to strategize. You know, you got to do a strategic plan. You got to look at what the context is that you're living in. You have to understand what the problems are. Who is the community? Because obviously the community is not coming in your church. And if the community is coming into the church,
yeah,
then can that community, just by its giving on Sunday morning, sustain that church? And we know that's not true. So what else can we do that's differently? The model, there are a lot of models, but I look at model with Emory Memorial Church in Washington, D.C., Joel Daniels, and the job that he's done. You know, everything we're talking about right now in terms of property and land and all, he did it. And the land that the church is on traditionally was owned by a Black woman, you know, and I don't know all of the history, but this was years ago. And so now they pretty much bought this entire city block, you know, $50-something million for this project. They've got affordable housing surrounding the church building itself. They've got underground parking. They've got basketball court. They've got just a number of different facilities there. Right now, you know, if everything is on hold because of the fact that you've got COVID going on, but they've got commercial kitchen, they've got the restaurant, they've got the jazz club there, you know, and they got all of this stuff that is there, and it's in a community that's been trying to gentrify for a long time. But they said, you know, we're going to flip this thing. You know, we're not going to let the gentrifiers come in and take over. We're going to do what it is that we need to do to transform this community for our folk in the community. You know, so I think that's one example of what churches can do. My church in Cleveland, we put together a strategic plan. We actually used Joe as our consultant, and we got a strategic plan. You know, my church is one that's in the University Circle area of Cleveland. And University Circle is this place where all the arts and culture and all of these different things, Case Western Reserve University is there, all of this stuff is there. And so now we're looking at, okay, how do we do programming and things that are going to engage people that are interested in all the rest of this stuff in, you know, this building, you know, and that's so much focus on, you know, how many numbers of people we're going to get on Sunday morning that are going to pay their tithes and offerings so that now we, you know, keep the church running that way. But we're looking at how can we repurpose this building as opposed to selling it and somebody repurposing it for us.
Yes. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. In fact, it's interesting how we got here because our next webinar next month is on place-based economics, looking at how we can invest in local communities. And that will be the second Thursday in December. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation. It will be on our YouTube channel for those that couldn't stay with us the whole night. There'll be a transcript for this conversation as well. We want to encourage people to visit us at fishingdifferently.net to sign up for future conversations. But again, I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been an amazing conversation. To those of you who've joined us on Zoom, those watching us on Facebook or YouTube, you know, I just want to challenge you. A number of books have been mentioned tonight. I encourage you to get the books, to learn, to study, to show yourself approved. I want to especially thank Dr. Bridgen for really kind of teeing this up around thinking about the work of the church is not all about just sacred work, but it's also about just human work. Dr. Augustine reminded us about the intersection of piety and purpose. We've got to be clear about our purpose beyond just our piety. Frank, thank you for reminding us that churches have to have power and love working in concert. Thank you so much. And Enchanta, thank you for letting us know that social media does work. Amen. It works, and it's a way to organize with community organizing and building power together. And again, Dr. Everett, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, our guests. Have a good night. God bless you.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
Thank you.
It was great meeting you.
Good seeing y'all.